we had an idea for a second Mad Max. And for me, it was very, very seductive because there was an opportunity to put everything I'd learned from the first Mad Max into a second film.
We went to the desert where there was not much of a backdrop, just dry gulch, you know, and shot it with some really cool concepts in it and different good characters. I think it was really kind of out there. It was like, when people saw it, they were like, whoa, they'd never quite seen anything like that.
Of course, Mel Gibson was fantastic and the cars and everything like that, but it wasn't just the cars and the stunts, just a whole lightning in a bottle.
You look at the first Mad Max, he's lost his wife and family. So now, what sort of man is that? This is the lone hero. This is Clint Eastwood. This is Yojimbo. This is Shane.
Unwittingly, we tapped into a classic archetype.
George's intrigued about how this very low budget, pretty rough and ready Australian movie should have such cultural significance all around the world.
I then began to ask myself, why was the film a success? Something else had happened here.
Yeah, there'll be people who will tell you it's because it was Mel Gibson, or because the music was good, or because George is a tour de force director. And none of those things are inaccurate, but they are not the explanation. The explanation is much deeper than that.
Road Warrior Mad-Max 2 was an opportunity to put all those things that we'd learned from the first Mad Max. Not only just the physical filmmaking, not only the logistics, but making it much more a mythological story. Mad Max was the first film we made, basically. The budget was very, very small, and it was a very complex and ambitious film to make. And I thought that if you planned a film really, really well, and Byron Kennedy and I planned it really, really well, meticulously, that it was just a matter of executing it. But everything went wrong. Like the most trivial things and some more serious things, just so many things went wrong that I felt very, very defeated by it. So by the time we finished the film, I thought, wow, I don't know what hit me. It was like I'm not cut out to make film. We could afford post-production for about 6 weeks. After that 6 weeks, we completely ran out of money, and Byron said, well, that's going to be the film. And I said, look, I know that there's a better film in there. So basically, for the next 9 months to a year, I cut the picture in the kitchen with the most rudimentary equipment, which is an HKS viewer, which was a sync machine, and Byron cut the sound in the lounge. And the most interesting thing by far was that I spent best part of a year looking at my own footage and confronted with all my mistakes. And it turned out to be a very valuable lesson because, you know, right down deep inside my DNA, I was learning about the few things I did right and the many things I did wrong. And I always thought if I had a chance to do it again, I would do this, I would do that, and so on. When I did finish the film, though, I remember speaking to Peter Weir, and this is before the film was released. I said, I don't think I'm cut out to do this. I thought I could be a filmmaker, but it was just way too hard. You know, I described it like being walking a really big dog, and you wanted to go this way, and it drags you off this way in another direction. And I remember Peter said something that really stuck with me, which was, look, it's always like that. It's always difficult making movies. And he said, it's like being in patrol in the jungle, and you've got your platoon, you've got your mission, and he said, you don't know where the landmines are or the snipers are or whatever. Whatever happens, you have to be flexible enough to complete the mission. And once that war analogy got into my head, that changed my filmmaking forever, because it's true. You've got to go in. You cannot predict everything that's going to happen. In fact, you've got to almost embrace the unpredictability, having done the preparation. What was really amazing to me is that the film, which I thought was unreleasable, started to get traction, territory by territory, all around the world. That was pretty unexpected experience. And I'd been bruised enough to realize it wasn't because I was particularly clever. So I felt like I dodged a big bullet and was grateful for that. And I felt if I'm to make other films, I really need to understand a number of things. The first was more about filmmaking and the process. The second was a lot more about acting, and also to understand why the film was successful around the world.
George and I would spend 16, 18 hours a day talking about storytelling, doing just the most intense work.
Terry Hayes, who wrote the novelisation of the first Mad Max book, he started to read up on storytelling and reading the books on storytelling and so on, and as did I. And then we got onto Joseph Campbell, who wrote A Hero with a Thousand Faces. Once we got into that, I began to realise that Mad Max's success was that it tapped into a universal archetype. That in Japan he was the same as a samurai, and the French saw the first Mad Max movie as a Western on wheels, and the Scandinavian saw him as a classic Icelandic or Viking warrior, and so on around the world.
George and I were obsessed with this, not just about Joe Campbell, but about trying to understand storytelling's part in a much broader context.
And understanding that, and that we were, in a sense, the servants of a collective unconscious in the way that Jung and people like Campbell really elucidated, really informed us about storytelling and how Mad Max fits into that tradition.
The juice, the precious juice.
In my career as a radio producer, I'd actually come up with a brilliant idea. I think I only ever had one brilliant idea, and it wasn't even original. So I came up with this idea. It'd be a good idea if we did a sort of a War of the Worlds style thing, that the Arab oil embargo had just finished. If there's going to be a world war, it's all going to start in the Middle East, and it's going to start over oil. So I suggested to the on-air host that we'd do this, that we'd keep interrupting the program to bring news flashes. So we did. We warned everybody that this was just how the world might end, that what you're listening to is a recreation of a thing that's not happening. Well, it was really fascinating, because nobody heard that. People were driving to their schools to pick up their children, and they were going down to the supermarket to buy stuff, like clearing out shelves. There was such a latent fear, anxiety there at the time, that people were more than happy to suspend disbelief. When George and I started to talk about Mad Max 2, I said to him, well, you know, obviously it has to be set in a post-apocalyptic world because you've already established that. And I told him about my experience on the radio program. He said, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's say that's how the world ended.
In a very quiet, calm, beautiful city like Melbourne, when there was big restrictions on going to the gas station, and there was one gas station in the middle of the city at one point where there were massive queues of people. I remember it took 10 days of that for the first shot to be fired. Now, nobody fired at anybody else, but someone fired a gun in the air to warn people off. And then the police were called. I thought, if it only took 10 days, what would happen if it was 10 years when there was no fuel?
Well, you know, there's this great saying, said, I've seen the enemy, and it is us. This is not from outer space. This is not zombies. This is what happens when everything breaks down. To George and I, that became a very interesting thing.
What are you looking for? Come on, Max, everyone's looking for something. You happy out there, are you? Hey, wandering? One day blurring into another?
Mel was, I think, 21 on the first Mad Max. He was straight out of drama school. By the time we got to the second Mad Max, he'd matured a lot. His face was more chiseled and so on. I particularly remembered that.
Something very peaceful and serene about being in the desert, you know? And I just enjoyed the location, and I was 25 years old, you know, kind of just getting kicked off, really, enjoying the experience, you know, feeling my power.
Charisma's completely paradoxical. On the one hand, the charismatic actor is very, very accessible. You feel that you could be their best friend. On the other hand, they're completely mysterious and unpredictable. On the one hand, they can be very, very macho, but there's something female in their behavior, something flowy. There's a lot of paradox in charisma, and that was the thing I began to learn also in time, that what I'd first recognized in Mel, watching him do the first screen test on Mad Max. There was something that you just wanted to watch it again. There was something that held you in there. You were somehow, in some way, taken out of yourself in that moment and engaged fully with what he was sort of doing.
I think the main thing about, you know, being an action hero or a star in action films is you have to look like you're scared all the time. And like, it's not easy. A lot of these guys try to make it look easy, and it shouldn't. You should look like you're like flipping out the whole time. It's not easy, and you're scared, and you make it through anyway. You know? And try not to say too much. Try not to be uncool, but be scared. As an actor, I was a physical actor anyway. I used to get into my roles in a physical way. I think the audience relates to that. They can vicariously live through you.
2 days ago, I saw a vehicle that had hauled that tanker. You want to get out of here? You talk to me.
The great thing about the character that Mel Gibson played was that there was no rules anymore out there. There was no law and order. There was nothing. The only thing that distinguished people was their own moral system.
All hard on the exterior because he has to survive, but really there's a human heart beating in there someplace, you know? So that was how we approached that guy. Dirty, alone, weird. Out there in the wasteland, every moment could be his last, you know? In a hard, hard world.
That idea that you could do whatever you wanted, but some people chose to live by their own moral standards. And that's why he survived. That's why he smiled at the end. And that's why he triumphed. Because had he not, then the world's not worth living in.
In order to think about the aesthetics of Mad Max 2 or Road Warrior, you need to go back to the first Mad Max. The first Mad Max, interestingly enough, was written for what was then contemporary Melbourne in the late 70s. And we couldn't afford to block off Melbourne streets and populate them with extras and other cars and so on. It would have taken most of our budget. So Byron and I decided to go back into the back streets, the empty streets where you can see the grass growing up through the cracks in the asphalt and unused buildings already derelict, because we could get them for virtually nothing. So to explain that, I put a caption at the beginning of the movie which said, "A few years from now," and basically we were forced into a dystopian world. That was accidental. By the time we got to Mad Max 2, it was much more deliberate.
By this time, it was quite clear that the movie was going to live or die on being bold. And what we lacked in money, we had to make up for in inventiveness.
In order to design the film, the landscape was very, very key, and what we put in the landscape was very, very key.
You know, we sort of got into the whole punk leather bondage scene, and it was kind of like the Link set from King's Cross in Sydney, you know? It was this kind of sadomasochistic, kind of weird garb.
Wonderful costume designer, Norma Morrisson. She did Crocodile Dundee, she did so many other iconic Australian characters, and she lived not far from an S&M leather place that she'd have to walk past every day to walk to work. And she'd go in and she'd talk to the leather makers there, and they had studs, they had those chaps with the bottom cut out, which Wes wore, and basically that was Norma.
George spends a huge amount of time handling details, very small detail. You know, the steel thing of the humongous and the white of the people in there. And of course, Max in his leather with his squeaky leg. It's just, I mean, everywhere you looked, every person was an individual, everyone was special.
So we did have a sense that we were working on something that was kind of different for the time. And when people saw it was like, whoa, this is different. It's weird. It's, you know, why is the Mohawk guy got a blonde-haired boy with a chain around his neck on the bike? And why is he carrying a baseball bat? What is that about? It just left a lot of questions up there and created this kind of weird netherworld atmosphere of post-apocalyptic kind of dry gulchness that, I don't know, where the lawlessness was possible. They created a real world, and it was, you know, that's George and Terry, they do that.
Mad Max 2, we had a bigger budget so we could travel to a far location. And we ended up in a place called Broken Hill, which was way out towards the centre of Australia, which was the first big mining town in Australia. So that became sort of the spiritual homeland of the Mad Max movies.
The first place we looked at was a salt lake called Island Lagoon, which was this vast expanse of white salt. But in the end, George and Byron had a sort of friendly but raging fight on the cliff tops of Island Lagoon, where Byron was very worried that if the weather turned bad, the entire compound of that set would sink into the salt. So at the last minute, we kind of hopped on a plane and I drove from Woomera to Broken Hill, which I'd also surveyed. And on the road to Adelaide south, I saw these incredible sort of mountains sticking up, which were called the Pinnacles. And nobody had ever filmed there before. And I took them there thinking maybe this is a backup. And when we actually got there, we realised how fantastic it was because you could get up on those mountains and look down on the plain.
That's what plays so well in Road Warrior, the amount of land you can see. When Mel was up on top of that pinnacle, you can see forever. You know, you must be able to see like 50 miles, and it's just beautiful desert. The blacktop roads were real and the dirt roads around the compound were real. The area where the compound was built was right down off the pinnacles, which was just perfect.
And so we got a huge amount of looks in a sort of tight area, and we could do all those stunts because no one cared that much.
And then the set itself was a great enclosed compound. I think the idea of the bus as a door was wonderful. The tyres around the edge. It was built for real. It wasn't built Hollywood. It wasn't a balsa wood set. It was real.
You know, these days you tend to use, you know, polypipe and plastic stuff. That was expensive. So we used real pipes from the mines that we got lying around up at Broken Hill, which were starting to close down. So they had a lot of scrap steel and, yeah, everything had to be welded together.
When we first arrived here by helicopter and saw it, it was just stunning, staggering. And as a result of that, we started the film very high, very up, because we were just so impressed with what we'd seen the art department build.
When we blew it up in that spectacular explosion, they brought in, I believe, Army engineers to do it. They weren't special effects. They were like these guys had blown up battleships. So,
George said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, we're going to do this, going to do that. He said, no, I'm bringing in the Army. And they went, you can't bring in the Army. We're the special effects guys. He said, no, we're bringing in the Army because you can't get the type of explosives we want to use, but they can.
I mean, we're think we had to stop the air flights from Adelaide to Broken Hill when we actually blew the compound up, and we had to alert all of the mines in the area that we were exploding the compound because thousands of men were working underground and they would have heard that explosion. So when I think back, we had Menindee, which was all those dead trees for the gyrocopter sequence. We had the Pinnacles. We had the Mundi Plain. We had Stevens Creek, where the gyro captain comes out of the sand. There's a lot of great places, and that's all within half an hour of where everybody got up.
And you go to Broken Hill now and it still feels like Mad Max Town, like to this day. And that's obviously what the guys who were location scouting, when they came through Broken Hill, would have got a strong sense of, like, this is like such an amazing place.
All right, let's try it, please. Clear the background.
In order to make something feel like it was moving and kinetic, we had to keep the camera very, very low to the ground. By keeping it low to the ground, you got a lot of the road blur, as it were, and that gave you a sense of speed. If you look at films shot in the city, you had buildings going by, you had other things going by. But out in the wasteland, there was just the sky and the road. So the camera had to be very, very low. The second thing is we shot very, very much with wide-angle lenses, and we always move the camera. If you have wide-angle lenses, the audience has a chance to see where they are, but you also have a very, very strong sense of volume and space. So they're the two things, particularly when you're moving fast through a landscape, that sort of influence not only Mad Max 1, but Mad Max 2.
We shot most of it at various camera speed. 22 frames a second as opposed to 24 seemed to just give it that raw edge a little bit. You watch it at 24, it's like that. If you watch it at 22, it's just got a little scary edge to it. Speeds it up a tiny bit, makes it a little bit more shaky.
I interviewed two cameramen. One was Johnny Seal, who was still operating, but he hadn't shot anything, in a sense, lit anything by himself. And Dean Semler, who had made a very famous documentary on a steam train and shot some of the most beautiful footage just travelling through the landscape for the government film unit.
I did news, I did current affairs, I did documentaries, I did commercials, and bingo, now I'm doing features. So I was never trained by a cinematographer. I learned as I went along, and operating was very much an integral part of that. It also keeps the relationship down with the DP and the director as a one-on-one. It simplifies the communication.
It was a film that was shot basically in continuity. And in fact, had we not done that, we would not have been able to actually do the film in the time. Now, that was very, very helpful because I was able to keep in my head what I thought we had as we went. Remember, these are the days before there was video split, and it was the days when we wouldn't see our dailies until about a week after we shot them. So I relied enormously on the operator, on Dean Semler.
George has what he calls a circle of grace around the camera. And he loved the Aussie cameramen and the way they kept the harmony around the camera, the way they respected, the director and particularly the actors.
The thing that amazed me about that film was that it was such a kinetic film. It moved the whole time. And for a film to move as much as that, to always be on the move, like truck chases and stuff, it was amazing how we didn't actually go anywhere ever. It was always pretty still. A lot of wind machines being used and stuff, and nobody actually moving. It was just, shoot upwards, don't relate it to the ground, just make sure the sky's in the background, turn the fan on. And it looked like you're flying,
We decided when there was nothing going by, when there was just sky, we'd keep a lot of vibration going. And in some cases, we actually put it in very, very, back in those days, optically, which is quite expensive to do. But I remember Dean saying, the crew kept coming to him and saying, but, we're meant to keep everything smooth and that's our job, particularly the dolly grips and everything. We're saying, that's our job, and you're accepting, and George is accepting, what's he doing? And Dean said to me years later, he said, look, I'd say to them, I don't know what he's doing, but he seems to know what he's doing. And by then I had the authority of having made the Mad Max, so they just went along with it.
I'm not coming on this tanker. With a blood on this mother, no bastard tell me this going out these calls.
But I just had enough confidence from what I'd learned all that time in the cutting room and for the first Mad Max about how to approach the film.
George, throughout the whole shoot, looked like he was about to pass out from exhaustion. I mean, he worked like nobody I've ever seen, and he still kept pushing. So there were always sections of the script that he felt that we needed to work on, that we could elevate, that we could improve.
The film lives within George. He doesn't go to bed at night and forget it. So George never stopped. He would come, obviously at night he would think about the next day's shooting, which was immediate. And he would do these little sketches in the morning, and they were a great guide. You know, he did them, and he did them very well. They were rough, but the angles were good, and we understood the meaning and the editorial thoughts he had for the particular sequence we were going to do.
He's kind of like a mathematician, you know. He would do things that you'd say, "What is that you're doing? That's not going to work." And he'd say, "Yeah, it'll work," and it would. And it would seem really kind of cheesy and stuff. He almost like shot the edit. It was. He knew exactly the little pieces he needed to like slap it all together, and it was like math. It was like a scientist. He was just adding facts and figures and putting them together and watching the result. His approach seemed to be very methodical and very practical and kind of ingenious in a way.
And the way he would make you, as an actor, develop the character. He never developed the character. The written word was there, but he made you develop the character. He made you write a whole backstory to who this character was, from when he was born to when this film started, why he became who he was, where he came from, how he got to this point, so that by the time you actually walked on the set, you were more the character than you were yourself.
Well, obviously the bad guys are really critical, and it's important to know that the bad guys, they're not really the bad guys, they're just the antagonists, I mean, in the classic sense. So they have to find some authenticity in themselves. Humongous was a character who, you know, obviously had to have a body, you know, a muscle guy, and Kjell Nielsen, who played him, was Swedish, and what was interesting about it was I always thought we couldn't hear his voice, and he spoke with a thick accent, and I thought, oh, we'd revoice him with somebody else. But we recorded him, and he sounded well enough. Sometimes I have trouble hearing his dialogue, but people know his dialogue so well now.
Fear is only a lie. The gasoline will be ours. Then you shall have your revenge.
Wes, who was his sort of surrogate and very, very central to the story, Vern Wells had been in the theatre. He'd very, very nice person, the opposite of his character, a crazy man.
I went up, and when George explained to me the character, I said, you might as well fly me back home, because I can't do it. You know, there's no way I can do that character. It just is not who I am. You know, I can't get those emotions to come out for you. And he said, yeah, okay, fine, whatever. Just go away and let them do their makeup and wardrobe thing. So they took me and they actually put me in the full wardrobe, shaved my head, did the full makeup on me without letting me see a mirror. And they did this whole thing, and then they sent me back to George. And George had a full-length mirror on the wall of his office, and I walked in, and he looked up from his desk with his glasses down. He goes, yeah, I think it works. Yeah. Turn around. So I turned around, and there I was, full frame in the mirror, and I just went, pop. And it was like, that was the character, and it was like so simple from that moment on. It was like it was staring at me in the face. He was a brilliant man. He understood the psychology because of where he came from being a doctor and everything. He understood the psychology of how to make you realize your potential. And I think if he hadn't done that, I would not be here. I never would have done the film.
In terms of the golden youth, you know, I always try to stay a little off the cliche, and usually there was a girl on the back of the biker's vehicle. I thought, this is the post-apocalyptic world. Things have to be tangential in a way, sort of working off the cliche. So let's put a guy on the back, you know.
We were in our pre-production offices over at Balmain here in Sydney, and George and I were talking about stuff, and he'd happened to look out the window, and a courier was arriving, and the courier got out to deliver this package. And George turned to me and said, "There's golden-haired youth." I said, "What?" He said, "There he is." And we went over to the window, we had a look, and there was this guy walking across. So George runs downstairs, or says to one of the production assistants, "I didn't go down, get him." So he went from being a courier to being on the back of a motorbike, being golden-haired youth.
I didn't think of in terms of, sexuality or whatever, but by the time people with Norma's sort of S&M gear and so on, that crept into the movie.
The gyro captain, that really came from the exigencies of filming. George knew that to justify doing aerial shots, which, were expensive and that, it would be great to have this gyrocopter. Bruce Spencer's a very well-known Australian actor, had been in a number of great films, and, it's really hard not to love Bruce. So we thought, this is fantastic.
And all of the stuff with the gyro, with Bruce Spence and that gyrocopter, that was done on the back of a low loader with the gyro on it. And I had a semicircular track around it with a marine head that can go sideways plus up and down and on a little jib arm, so I could float this thing around anywhere. And we did the whole thing there, just in this one position. I had a light that we could move around if we wanted to. And so that thing never flew with Bruce in it. It was a silly little pilot, funny little guy called Jerry, who flew it. He was quite a character also.
I remember sitting at lunch one day out on Broken Hill, and somebody said, "Hey, look at Jerry." Jerry was the gyro captain. And I didn't bother looking. They said, "Oh, Jerry's just crashed." Jerry had been flying overhead and got pow into the ground.
Jerry Goodwin, who doubled for Bruce Spence as the gyro captain, I've had the pleasure of meeting Jerry a few times. And Bruce is Jerry, Bruce Spence is Jerry. Like, Jerry is this kind of sweet, lanky man, but this, I want to say, mad aviator.
I think Jerry built the gyrocopter in his garage. This was not Department of Civil Aviation approved flying machine. I can promise you that. So we were always on tenterhooks with that.
My life fades. The vision dims. All that remains are memories.
I remember a time of chaos, ruined dreams, this wasted land. But most of all, I remember the road warrior, the man we called Max. And my name's Emil Minty, and I played the feral kid in Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior. The character as the feral kid was pretty wild, but that was me. I was 8 years old, and I was running around the set and running around in the dust and dirt, and so for me it sort of came naturally.
There are always those children somewhere in the world born into war, and that ability of children to survive, even in the most, virtually on the streets, but survive with still an innocence and an enthusiasm that children always have, despite being traumatized, and that was the feral boy.
I remember going around to the moat, like around the compound, there was like a moat, and in there was all rubbish, and I was rummaging through there, and I found this box of washers, and I put them on a string, and Archie Whiteley, she played the captain's girl, I actually put this on a string, and I made a necklace, and I gave it to her, and you sort of see in the movie she actually wears it, so it became part of her costume, which was pretty amazing, and now I'm a jeweler, so it's quite funny.
Go up there and growl at the camera. Right down the lens. Run up to it.
The feral kid had a weapon of choice. He had a metal boomerang, but I've actually got it here now. I've still got it till today. This was the boomerang that was used to when I caught it, and so it's got some holes in it and had some fishing line that went up to a motor, ran along a boom and basically spun around, and a guy, you know, out of shot of camera, pressed a button and it would turn around, and obviously they directed it into my hand, and that was how I caught the boomerang, because they weren't able to throw a metal boomerang at an 8-year-old kid and expect to catch it.
How long? That's
unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
I remember the first moment you walked through the door.
Yeah.
And you walked in. I thought, oh, God, you had a fantastic energy. And I thought, and you were just like that all the way through. And whenever I threw at you, you did.
You did. Yeah.
Remember I asked you, do you think you can growl like a dog?
Yeah.
Straight into it.
Yeah.
Do you remember crawling onto the...
On the truck?
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely remember crawling on the truck. I bumped into Vernon a couple of years back when he came to Sydney, and I bumped into him, and he reminded me that although I remembered certain things, he reminded me that scene he was coming up, and there was a few takes where I was laughing, and I couldn't stop laughing. And he said to me, I wasn't getting scared. So what he did is he got a sponge, and I'm pretty sure this is what he said. He got a sponge with blood on it, and he came up and he just had it hidden, and he grabbed my hand, so the blood all sort of went spurted on. And that actually scared me. So I actually got scared. He reminded me that because he said I was laughing.
I don't remember the sponge, but I do remember you laughing.
Laughing,
like,
yeah. Because this is fun. Yeah, it was fun because I saw what was going on. It wasn't like a surprise to me because I saw him getting made up with all the blood, and I knew he had blood capsules and things, I think, in him, and you know, that's what I mean. It was fun for me. It wasn't scary. So yeah, probably, you know, trying to be scared when you're having fun on the front of a truck is quite difficult. So yeah. And then it's wow, it's 35 years or
1981 or 2.
Yeah, 1981. Yeah, it's amazing. I just said to
hold up the boomerang. I think it boiled down to that everybody in that film wanted to be there. Everybody in that film wanted to be doing the film, regardless of how much money we had or didn't have. We just wanted to be there working on that particular project. And I think that's what made the film so good, was that you see the heart in that film, you see the heart that comes out, and it resonates onto the screen. I think that's what made it such a nice film.
Guy Norris, who was 21 when he did that movie. By the time he did Fury Road, he was in his 50s. Guy was, you know, very thoughtful, very focused, young stuntman even at that age. He appears in the movie. He doubles Wes. He plays his own character, the claw guy who grabs Max at the end. We're going to do a classic T-bone, which is a guy on a bike hits a vehicle, but clears the vehicle and just goes flying through the air.
It was something we'd done many times before in live shows. We called it the cannonball stunt. And what you would do is you would usually take the door off a car, you'd have a small ramp, and so the motorcycle would fit inside the car, except the handlebars would be just above the car, and so you would hit it right where the headlight of the motorcycle would be. Just the moment that you hit the bottom of the ramp, you launch yourself up in the air, you sail over the top and land in boxes or mats or whatever you have on the other side.
And it was a vehicle that had just flipped. And then I thought, that's not going to cut if you go from a vehicle that's still moving. If it's static, it needs to have some movement in it. So I said, could we just put a cable on it so it could move a little bit? Which I think was my first mistake, because Guy wasn't hitting a static vehicle, it just had a little bit of movement in it. My second mistake was, wait a moment, when the vehicle rolled, there was a lot of dust, and then suddenly there's no dust. So I said, could we just make a little bit of dust just before we go at the right moment? So they put a little dish with a bit of dust and a little charge in there, so it went poof to create a bit of dust. And then Guy starts coming at this thing.
I remember coming down, probably in hindsight, going much faster than I probably should have but you know, the open road in front of you, so it's hard to hold back. And I remember leaping off the bike and thinking, this is great. And then all of a sudden, I remember seeing ground, sky, ground, sky, ground, sky. So I knew I was tumbling and didn't realise why until later. And really was just sort of timing my next roll to basically try and lay out as best I can on the very last impact into the boxes.
Now, he did the stunt, and because I put that little bit of movement, that little bit of rocking in there with the dust, it was a little harder for him to see. And instead of the bike hitting and then him clearing it and going over the top, the bike hit, and he hit it with his leg, his knee.
I think he left the bike a bit early, and the bike went ahead and raised the buggy up enough for him to hit his shins against the top of the buggy. That sent him going like a rag doll through the air. And I was shooting from the side of the road. I panned with him as he came through. We had another camera down the bottom. We might have even had 2 cameras down the bottom for that, but that hurt. That hurt, that one.
And when he landed, and I remember running over and having a look and realising that he had no head injuries or anything like that. I realised he'd hit his leg, but expecting to see his leg shattered. And I remember he was just there doing some sort of Zen meditation to push away the pain.
As soon as that happened, I thought I'd dislocated my hip. It just didn't feel bad, it just felt uncomfortable. And I remember George rushing over and everybody being there and trying to stand up and, my leg not working.
I looked at him and I realised, wait a minute, he didn't break his leg. Now, what he didn't tell us was that some months before, I don't know how long it was, he'd had a similar injury, broke his femur, and had a pin in his bone. When they took him to hospital, x-rayed him, the leg didn't break, but the pin bent. And it was amazing because they wrote it up as a medical article of a bent pin of someone who had already broken their femur.
And so because I was still playing the character of Bear Claw, I still had the end sequence to do, which is where I climb onto the tanker, fight with Mel through the rear window, and then Emil Mitty's character then comes and tries to attack me. And so we ended up putting that off for a week or 2, and literally what I would do is come out on set and have my foot up on a box, and we continued filming the end in simulated travel for the rest of the film.
If it's all the same to you, I'll drive that tanker.
In terms of the final chase, that was built up in that same way. Storyboards one day ahead, having a good idea of where it's going to go, knowing that the tanker was going to crash at the end, it was to be full of sand and things like that.
Somebody kind of like matched the chariot race in Ben-Hur, the whole truck driving sequence. In fact, it was kind of like that chariot race, people flying under the wheels and all kinds of caper, using dummies and all the old movie tricks, And
I remember there was a big debate about who should roll the tanker. And Dennis Williams, who was a truck driver himself, who was doing all the basic truck driving, but wasn't doing stunts, said, well, sure, we could get a stunt driver to do it, but they've never rolled a truck before. No one had in Australia. He said, but I was actually, in my normal job, flipped one of my trucks.
On the morning of the stunt, he was pretty nervous, I think. We were all down eating our bacon rolls. We used to have hot bacon rolls and cups of tea in the morning. It was cold in the desert. And Dennis was pacing up and down, looking a little nervous. He couldn't eat or drink anything because if he went to hospital, he had to have an empty stomach. Anyway, he went up to the top to his start mark, which was out of our shot, out of our vision, and we heard the engine start. He gave us the signal, doot, doot. When he was up to speed, we rolled cameras. He came down and did this spectacular stunt, just rolled it. It rolled perfectly, the positions we expected it to roll in. We had a Ned Kelly down there, which covered it beautifully. The dust settled. We got the thumbs up. He had like red dust on that brilliant red outback dirt over his face and white eyes. And one of the earliest things I think he said was, "Can I have a bacon roll now, please?" I think he'd earned it.
It pretty well landed right in front of that camera, as well as watching the profile cameras and so on. So I remember I was very, very happy that not only was the stunt pulled off, and of course Dennis survived unharmed, but also it landed in front of the camera. And it echoed many, many years later when we did the same thing on Fury Road. At the very, very end of the movie, when the truck rolls with Max and the feral kid, when they came out, the people in wardrobe covered him in full as earth, in dust. And I thought, oh, look at that leather. It looks so sculptural and very interesting. And Max's face all covered in dust and so on, and he's bleeding. And I thought, that's how we should have started the movie. So by the time we got to Fury Road all these years later, he started off definitely dusty to begin with.
You risk an enormous amount when you go out there and you do a movie. Nobody could have risked more than George. Nobody could have risked it, and nobody could have tried harder. And whatever success the franchise has had, it's because of him and his nature and his abilities and his determination.
And the Road Warrior, that was the last we ever saw of him. He lives now only in my memories.
The thing about Mad Max 2 was it kind of proved so much of what I'd learnt from the first movie, not only in content but in process.
I heard that it was possibly the most copied film of the 80s. That all of a sudden it opened this door for people with ideas they could now put into that sort of genre.
There was a real sense that it was kind of original. I mean, nobody had ever seen wardrobe like it. And then very soon it was all in the pop world. It works in a larger sense too, and then it's sort of mythical, that hero myth. The stories they've been telling in caves for centuries, you know, about the guy who came and he didn't have a name, but he saved mankind, you know, whatever it was. These are on film all reflections of those hero stories.
There are 3 people who worked on that movie that went on to win the Oscar. Now you tell me how many other low-budget Australian movies had 3 Oscar winners. Mel Gibson, Dean Semler, George Miller were all there in very pivotal positions on that film, who all went on for other films to win the Academy Award.
People still talk about it. People still look at it. People still want to see it. I get people come up to me that weren't probably born when I made that damn film, but they want to know about it. They want to talk about it. That to me is what a film is supposed to be. That's what gives me the most in here, is that I know I was involved in something that was unique.
It seemed to be some sort of cultural reference point of a certain genre. And that's pretty gratifying, I mean, because you know that all work is cultural evolution, that, you know, in any medium anyone works in, it's someone building on what has come before, and then you have something that shifts the paradigm a little bit. And if Road Warrior did that to some extent, I mean, that's very pleasing. But you can't predict any of that. You just do your work and you hope that you put enough of your skills and knowledge and your wisdoms into that process. And you tell stories. If they impinge in some way on the zeitgeist, that's a really great thing. And if it doesn't, they're easily forgotten. And that's what happens in this world. So I must say, you've got to be grateful for when some of your work sticks to some degree.